I'm incredibly proud to have Dr. Brian DeRubertis come up here and present two-year data from probably one of the most important clinical trials in the last several years of the lower extremity space. So Brian, thank you for joining us. We'll hear a little bit more about the two-year LIFE-BTK results.
Thanks a lot, Eric. So it's a real privilege to present on behalf of my co-investigators, Sahil Parikh and Ramon Varco, all of the clinical sites that participated, as well as the clinical team at the sponsor, Abbott Vascular. We'll be showing the two-year outcomes of LIFE-BTK randomized controlled trial evaluating the Esprit BTK scaffold for infrapopliteal disease. Excuse me. So obviously there's a number of challenges to successful tibial intervention. Those are listed on the left here. Essentially what you have to do is grapple with the effects of the residual mechanical forces affecting the tibials, as well as the biologic restenosis that occurs. There are a number of options for doing this listed here. You'll notice that of all of these different options, atherectomy, POBA, DCB, which we don't of course have here, but in Europe is available, there's really only one option that can do this in a way in which we attack the mechanical issues with a scaffold, elute drug to prevent biologic restenosis while leaving options open down the road and leaving no permanent implants. And that's the recently approved Esprit BTK DRS device, or drug-eluting resorbable scaffold. So just to review, this device is a bioresorbable scaffold with a backbone comprised of PLLA, a strut thickness of about 99 microns, similar to Xience or other DES devices. It has a coating of a bioresorbable polymer that elutes everolimus over time. The intention of this device is to allow for drug elution over the first 30 to 90 days, full mechanical support of the vessel out to about 6 to 9 months, where we start to have degradation of the device, followed by full resolution, full reabsorption of the device out to 2 to 3 years. So this was evaluated in the LIFE-BTK randomized multi-center trial. This was a trial that randomized 261 patients in a 2-to-1 fashion between Esprit BTK and PTA. These results were, of course, presented 1 year ago at this time at TCT with a simultaneous publication in the New England Journal of Medicine. And these results ultimately led to FDA approval of the device in April of 2024, and now commercialization. And we now have a new option for treating our patients, essentially. I'll be presenting here today the 2-year results of this trial. So to review, the primary efficacy endpoint was a composite of limb salvage and primary patency. This was defined as freedom from above ankle amputation in the index limb, 100% total occlusion of the target vessel, binary restenosis of the target lesion determined by duplex criteria, as well as CDTLR at 12 months. The primary safety endpoint was a standard male pod, freedom from above ankle amputation in the index limb, or major reintervention at 6 months, as well as perioperative death at 30 days. There were 2 additional powered secondary endpoints, the first of which was binary restenosis of the target lesion at 1 year, because this was somewhat of a new addition to typical Bologna composite endpoints. But we also wanted to evaluate the endpoint or the results without this issue of binary restenosis or this addition of binary restenosis. So the second powered secondary endpoint was more consistent with typical endpoints for BTK trials: freedom from above ankle amputation of the index limb, 100% total occlusion of the vessel, and CDTLR at 1 year. This flowchart shows our clinical follow-up, and you can notice that between 1 and 2 years on the Esprit arm there were 22 deaths, 7 deaths in the PTA arm, and this of course reflects to some degree the 2-to-1 randomization. In the Esprit arm there were no additional patients withdrawn or lost to follow-up. On the PTA arm there were 4 patients who fit one of those 2 issues, withdrawn or lost to follow-up. But overall the clinical follow-up was really quite exemplary at 88% and 85% between these 2 arms. The inclusion criteria are listed here. Essentially we wanted to recruit Rutherford 4 or 5 patients with lesions in the proximal 2/3 of the infrapopliteal arteries. The patient could be enrolled provided they had a greater than 70% stenosis. You could enroll up to 2 lesions, provided the vessel diameter was between 2.5 and 4 millimeters, and the total scaffold length was less than 170 millimeters between the 1 or 2 target lesions. In addition to achieving the target population we wanted in terms of demographics, we really tried to mirror our CMS patient population. In terms of sex and ethnicity and race, et cetera. So we really matched that quite well, at least according to CMS data. In addition to that, we really got the type of patients we wanted from a CLTI standpoint. So these were Rutherford 4 and 5 patients, roughly equally split between the two. But if you look at these different risk factors, this is among the sickest populations we've seen in a Bologna trial. Hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and diabetes were almost ubiquitous in this patient group, as was prior PAD diagnosis and a number of other risk factors. Lesions were relatively equally split between the different tibial arteries and the TPT. The average lesion length was about 44 millimeters in each arm, both Esprit and PTA. There were no differences between all of these different issues listed here. Site-reported calcification of moderate to severe degree was noted in about 30% of patients, although we really did not do core lab adjudication of this particular fact. To review the 12-month data that was presented 1 year ago, this is shown here. So obviously we had a very significant difference between the Esprit arm and the PTA arm, 74.2% for the Esprit arm versus 47.9%. So this was a 30 percentage point difference and a very highly statistically significant difference. Moving to the 2-year results. These are shown in this Kaplan-Meier curve. And there's a couple of things to point out. The first I'd point out is that this, again, had a very highly statistically significant difference between the Esprit scaffold arm and the PTA arm, 68.8% versus 45.4%. So again, of the two things I'd sort of point out about this, between 1 year and 2 years, a very high difference, a very large delta between these two arms was noted at 28.66% or 6%. That's compared to 30 percentage points at 1 year. So really no change in that delta over the 1 to 2 year time point, showing the sustained durability of the device. The other thing I'd point out is that if you look at the Esprit arm, 68.8%, this is only 5.4 drop in this endpoint between 1 and 2 years. So again, it shows a very high degree of durability to the device. Looking at this on a landmark analysis, this is something we noted in the first trial, or the 12-month results. If you look at the 6-month endpoint, or 6-month time point, there was really very little difference between these two curves. These curves tended to splay or separate between the 6-month and 12-month endpoint, and that really kind of argues to the biologic effect of the drug. So it's not just a scaffold issue. If it was just scaffold alone showing this difference, then you'd expect some early PTA failures with the scaffolding that helped the scaffold arm, and you'd see an early separation of these curves. So there was probably some benefit to the scaffold, but there was certainly, this landmark analysis certainly should suggest that a biologic effect is occurring. The other thing to note is that really this change, separation of the curves really ends around 12 to 15 months, showing that once we get past that first 15 months or so of restenosis, the patency generally will be maintained long term. Looking at the two powered secondary endpoints, the first, of course, was binary restenosis of the target lesion at 2 years. And this was an important driver of our overall primary endpoint, and we see that the Esprit-BTK scaffold compares very favorably in terms of binary restenosis or prevention of binary restenosis. The PTA arm suffered binary restenosis in 48.2% versus 28.5% for the Esprit scaffold. Looking at the second powered secondary endpoint, so this is a composite of limb salvage and primary patency 2 years without the binary restenosis. Again, we find that there was a maintained delta of about 15 percentage points between 1 and 2 years. Again, suggesting that even without the duplex-determined binary restenosis, we still have a significantly improved result in durability and clinical effect of the scaffold compared to PTA. Looking at freedom from clinically driven target lesion revascularization, obviously as interventionists we know that each of our repeat interventions takes a significant toll on the patient's quality of life and sort of mental health, I would even say. And so avoiding these TLRs and avoiding these reinterventions is very important. At 2 years, we did see a sustained benefit for the scaffold at preventing target lesion revascularization, 90.3% versus 81.4%, shown, sorry, let me go back one. So again, about a 9% percentage point difference between the two. Looking at safety, the composite of major adverse limb events at 2 years and the perioperative death at 30 days, we saw no difference between these two populations, these two groups, 96.0 and 91.7%. So very similar safety profile that's maintained out to 2 years. So in conclusion, I'd argue that the Esprit BTK scaffold offers continued superior long-term clinical outcomes compared to PTA alone, particularly in terms of limb salvage and primary patency, and this is sustained all the way out to 2 years. So sustained vascular patency and limb preservation at 2 years, so a really important part of this data set. The Esprit BTK scaffold significantly reduced binary restenosis and total occlusion, binary restenosis being a significant driver of that endpoint, arguing that the everolimus solution really is an important point, an important component of this device to prevent biologic restenosis. Finally, the safety profile of Esprit is maintained at 2 years, really arguing that this is a good long-term durable solution to our patients beyond the standard of care prior to April of 2024. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian, for that fantastic presentation and staying on time for us. We're going to open this up for questions. I'm going to ask you an easy one to start. How much of the scaffold's left at 2 years? So is there still a fair amount of integrity to the scaffold, or is this now a patent vessel again?
Yeah, great question. So the goal in implanting this device, and there's a very specific way in which we do this to make sure we have good wall apposition. So sizing is important, getting good wall apposition, getting the stent covered with a neo-intima, so that it can be fully reabsorbed within the wall of vessel without any risk of distal embolization. With that done, you really start losing mass at around 6 to 9 months. And so the mass dissipates over that 2-year period of time. At 2 years, if you look at animal models and the histology of those animal models, there's no structural support at 2 years. It's not exerting any effect on the vessel itself. And you still have some residual component of the device, but that is fully gone within 3 years. Yeah.
Brian, my congratulations.
Hi, Iris.
Well, that is a wonderful trial, and I mean, lost to follow up nearly no patient. That's amazing. I just want to underline that. So guess that's the stent in the future. We had the discussion FemPop. So you put an absorbable stent with drug into it. So if you do have to do a redo procedure, would you go with a drug-eluting stent or with a balloon or drug-coated balloon? So what would be your suggestion?
You mean in a re-intervention in the tibial space when you failed? Yeah, so I don't have any strong opinions on that necessarily. Here in the US, we don't have drug-eluting balloons or drug-coated balloons available for re-intervention. In general, for a failure, I'm going to make sure to use drug next time around. In a setting like this where you already have a scaffold and drug, I don't know that that drug is important for that specific scaffold that maybe failed. I think the bigger question, though, about failures or preventing failures is, the biggest question about failures is avoiding those failures, right? And so in this trial, I think it's worth noting that we use this as primary therapy, meaning we included full coverage of the lesion and did not allow treatment downstream of the lesion. And so one of my concerns in rolling this device out is the maybe tendency to use a scaffold proximally. Say you have a 200 millimeter occlusion, you balloon the whole thing, you place a scaffold proximally, and you let the rest be treated with balloon angioplasty alone. I think that's not necessarily the wrong strategy, but that's not how we did in the trial, and I'm not sure you'll have the same results. And so, my main focus is to make sure that we cover the whole lesion if possible, or if we have DCBs with proven efficacy, then maybe a combination strategy of scaffold proximally and DCB distally would make sense. But again, not having that in the U.S., my preference is to use this as primary therapy, full coverage of the lesion. I have had at least two cases in which I've treated distally with PTA alone, and it's failed, and it took down the stent with me, or with the distal failure. Those have been fairly easy to cross and retreat with balloon angioplasty alone and some additional scaffolding. But I think you do need to recognize that you can't see the scaffold particularly well, and that is a challenge for re-intervention when you're crossing a scaffold that is not particularly visible.
Brian, question. The severe calcification numbers were kind of low. In terms of intervention for the scaffolding strength, is this equivalent to off-label use of coronary DES? Is there a cut point in there somewhere in terms of capacity to address the severe calcium scaffolding?
Yeah, essentially the simple answer is yes, it's the same as a DES. So within its intended diameter, meaning if you take a 3.5 scaffold, you can inflate that up to 0.5 millimeters larger than that 3.5. So 3.5 scaffold goes from 3.5 to 4.0. If you stay within that range, it has essentially the same properties as a DES stent. In our trial, we did not do the images required for core lab adjudication of calcium, but as you saw from the risk factors of these patients, these were true CLTI patients. And so I'm not convinced that this really only included 30% moderate to severe calcification. We did have a requirement that the pre-dilatation balloon had to fully inflate before placing a scaffold, and we expected to have some issues with that, but we really didn't see too many.
And you mentioned that sizing is really important, and you stressed that. Are you using IVUS with all of these cases to make sure you're adequately sizing?
I encourage OCT or IVUS usage. I have used it in all cases. I think that's optimal technique. I don't think it's essential if you're doing a proper pre-dilatation and using that inflated balloon to compare to normal vasculature adjacent to that. I think you can get away without IVUS and still size quite fine. But it's pre-dilatation, implant, post-dilatation with a non-compliant balloon. But I do think IVUS is very helpful, and I would encourage it.
Before we wrap up, Brian, it's interesting to look at the data and say if we had run this trial 8 years ago, it would have been a null trial at 6 months to the FDA. And we've moved our benchmark to 12 months. We're now seeing 24 months. We saw in best CLI that durable patency leads to less recurrence of CLI. So is it time for us to rethink the idea that the wound heals and our job's done, and that 12-month and now 2 years is the important time points that we should be focusing on?
I think there's a good reason to suspect that we need to look more long-term at these devices. Certainly in this trial and all trial it involved CLTI patients. We did not have complete wound healing of all patients at 12 months. And we also noted in this trial, because of our wound core lab, we noted recurrent wounds over time. So it's the old adage that once you heal a wound, you don't need maintained patency. That's only kind of true. That's true to some degree in some patients, but many do recur.
Wonderful. Well, congratulations.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.